In Part 2, Chapter 5 of George Orwell's 1984, Winston Smith describes how he and his lover Julia would sometimes fall into fantasies about escaping the party, before just as quickly dismissing these as nonsense. But why did Winston so quickly dismiss the idea of escape? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider Winston's options for escape, as fantasized directly from the character's mind. We shall also consider their feasibility, and in the end, why Winston and Julia dismissed any idea of escape. So first things first, what exactly am I referring to here? Well, in Part 2, Chapter 5, we get these thoughts on ideas of escape that Winston and Julia have considered. Quote, "Often they gave themselves up to daydreams of escape. Their luck would hold indefinitely, and they would carry on their intrigue just like this for the remainder of their natural lives. Or Catherine would die, and by subtle maneuverings Winston and Julia would succeed in getting married, or they would commit self-deletion together, or they would disappear, alter themselves out of recognition, learn to speak with proletarian accents, get jobs in a factory, and live out their lives undetected in a backstreet." Yet straight away, or perhaps even as these thoughts occur to them, they are just as quickly dismissed as nonsense, Winston admitting, quote, "In reality, there was no escape." So the interesting thing that strikes me firstly is that escape does not necessarily equate to extraction from their society, at least in two instances, getting married or simply maintaining the status quo of their relationship. The implication is that escape means a sort of deception, allowing their secret relationship to continue. Incidentally, for the keen-eared, like men such as Charrington and O'Brien listening in, this would be an unwitting betrayal of what mattered most to the two lovers, their love for each other. Indeed, this is borne out later on, at least in Winston's case, as his love for Julia is the last thread of individuality and resistance that stops his full submission to the party and Big Brother. One glaring elephant in the room we have to acknowledge before continuing is that, unbeknownst to them, the lovers had already effectively been caught, even at that stage, and were being closely monitored. This fact alone makes any form of escape, bar self-deletion, very unlikely aside from some extreme event, such as the chaos of a revolution, or invasion or something of that ilk that would aid their escape. To make our considerations interesting, however, let's humour the lovers and act as if they were not being monitored. Would escape for each of their options still be impossible? Well, nothing is strictly impossible, but I would wager that the probability of escape in most of these instances is much closer to 0 than 1. Take the marriage escape. Assuming that the two could somehow pull it off, firstly, Winston was already married, which is why he likely dismissed this option without much further thought. As far as he knew, Catherine was still alive. In the Ministry of Love, he bitterly recalled how he had been compelled to confess to Catherine's murder, even though both he and his captors knew that she was still alive. Catherine's death or vaporization would thus be a prerequisite for any marriage to be possible. Her death without the couple's involvement was, of course, a matter of chance. It's not impossible she could have died of malnutrition or disease, though this does seem doubtful. Most individuals, though likely underweight and haggard, seem to hold up okay, with some like Parsons even being overweight. Another possibility is that Catherine could have been vaporized. In some respects, however, this is almost as unlikely as the aforementioned avenue of death. If you've watched my previous video on Catherine, or recall her character from Winston's recollections in the book, Catherine is a genuine good thinker, a staunch orthodox party woman, perhaps arguably the most orthodox outer-party character in the novel, who seemed to possess the right instincts as well as the right thoughts. Given this, her vaporization seems quite unlikely. Another perhaps more feasible way is that the lovers could track down Winston's wife and help her along into death. This, on the surface, seems a simple matter. However, following his separation from Catherine, there's no indication Winston has a clue where she resides or works, Though the party forbids divorce and the two are still technically married, they are treated, for all intents and purposes, as divorced and separate individuals, far more so than in our real world, where it's common for divorced couples to have some contact on some level. In the world of 1984, Winston and Catherine may as well be strangers, the two unaware of the details of their current existence. As Winston explains in the novel, it was not common to know someone else's address, or even have close friendships or ties for obvious reasons. What's more, assuming that Winston or Julia could somehow track her down, they would then have to deal with the dangers of murdering a party member. The other consideration we haven't looked at yet too, is if this would even be a good idea anyway. Even if Catherine could be gotten rid of, marriages were not a simple matter of organising the church ceremony and then nipping down the pub for the reception afterwards. As with all things in Oceania, marriage was heavily controlled, with potential matches being scrutinised by a committee appointed for the task. The two would likely be interrogated on their association. The basis of this proposal could be construed as suspicious. Though the two both worked in the Ministry of Truth, they never particularly crossed paths or worked together. They saw each other occasionally in hallways, the 2 minutes hate in the canteen, but it may provoke uncomfortable and dangerous questions during this process. Another factor is fooling the committee into believing there's no romantic feelings or sexual attraction between them. Winston and Julia are clearly attracted to one another, and even the best actors may find it difficult to fully mask such an attraction. Would this committee all be fooled? Winston does tell us that no marriage is sanctioned if the couple in question shows any sign that they are attracted to one another, given the only purpose of matrimony is to sire children for service to the party. Another thing to consider here too is the prize of success. Even if Winston and Julia somehow, after all this, achieved marriage, they would scarcely be in a much better position. In fact, they would arguably be worse off. Yes, they could live together, but they would also be under the scrutiny of the telescreen in their residence, while the expectation of children would be a heavy burden on the couple, particularly Winston too, who had already failed to produce children in his first marriage. Children too, as we see with Parsons' fate, are also not conducive to continuing an illicit romantic relationship. The status quo option, at least to the couple themselves, seemed to be the favoured option, simply given that's how they continued until capture. However, both knew that it was only a matter of time before they were detected or made a mistake. I would argue that Winston himself always knew his arrest was a matter of when, not if, when he was single and alone, let alone after adding a fellow rebel lover to the mix. Forgive my euphemisms carrying on, comrades, as there are certain unwords that anger the mighty BBs of our world. So, on the surface, I consider unaliving themselves together as the most practical form of escape, though, of course, this ends their own relationship in the process, even if it also spites the party. Unfortunately too, given what we know about their exposure, it's very likely that the Fort Police had enforcers nearby on close standby at all times, just in case such an attempt was made. Given the couple were blissfully unaware that they were effectively caught already during their affair, it's probable any serious preparations towards the deed would have brought about their earlier arrests to prevent this. Self-deletion is most practical for a party member in isolation, in my opinion. Winston certainly believed it happened, and Julia herself confirms this was how her first lover perished to avoid the Fort Police, saving her in the process. Outside of one's own mind, however, two or more comrades openly talking about it, even briefly, would expose them to capture. In all likelihood, party self-deletions are isolated, with mass or multiple self-unalivings being exceptionally rare, if not impossible. This, as we saw earlier, however, was not why Winston rejected it as a form of escape. It seems that Winston is just never ready to commit the act, even much later when he has definitely been seized by the thought police. In his cell before his interrogation, he doubts he would even use the razor blade, even if presented with it, thinking it was more natural to live moment to moment, even with the knowledge of terrible suffering to come. While not stated openly by Winston, I think it's also obvious that at this stage too, Winston and Julia have the added incentive of their love for one another that makes self-deletion unappealing. Winston even indirectly supports this at one stage, willingly taking on more party work in a factory. This at Julia's suggestion to help camouflage himself further, to forestall suspicion and thus remain alive longer by extension. Love and simple will to survive were the reasons Winston never seriously considered this path then. So what about the final option the lovers consider? Well, it's likely not shocking to anybody listening that I think this is the least feasible form of escape. One glaring reason is that learning proletarian accents, finding a place to live, creating trusted contacts and so on, all take time. The wider the couple spread their own net of conspiracy, finding genuine unwitting allies in their quest to fit in. For example, another Charrington figure to rent from only widens the possibility for betrayal and exposure. Winston probably thinks this possibility is rather daft too, given the gulf between his own class and the proles. He admits that not much was really known about the proles, implying that the party were generally, and for good reason, from the perspective of the inner party, set apart from this vast lower class. We know that living areas are strictly set apart, with the sight of a party comrade in the prole areas being a relatively rare occurrence, at least openly. The black market seems to thrive, but this is illicit at best. My point then is that, though contact is likely regular between the groups, any deep collaboration between them would not be tolerated by the thought police. A few agents of the thought police, like Charrington, are always among them, making it a dangerous roll of the dice whether a comrade would be spotted and exposed. The trouble too is that merging into the prole class is also harder than it seems. Winston is intelligent, likely well spoken, and has other class markers that the untrained individual will find it difficult to erase or even mask. How easy would it be for the likes of Julia and Winston to truly fit in? Winston especially may find such an existence grating after a time. Though Winston often thinks on the proles as a sort of collective saviour for his own class and society, that someday, somehow, they will rise up and crush Big Brother and the party, he also doesn't hide his contempt for them at times. He laments their lack of a mind specifically, that they don't really think about their lot or politics. Proles are generally concerned with their petty personal grievances and hardships, with family, football, sports and gambling. Of course, superficially this kind of life is a veritable paradise compared to Winston and Julia's current precarious existence. However, could Winston really realistically fit himself into such a mindset and existence, to convincingly play the part of a prole, so to speak? Winston does have a genuine interest in politics and the mechanics of his society. He does prove willing to physically rebel above and beyond just existing as an illicit thought criminal. This doesn't strike me as particularly compatible with the quiet life of a prole. Given the physical and mental hurdles blocking a convincing integration into prole society, the couple's general lack of friends, family and connections within the prole community that they would hope to slip into would also make them stick out like a sore thumb, without the thought police even being involved. How could they easily integrate into any prole community without arousing suspicion within that community? So those were my thoughts on why each of Winston and Julia's fantasized options for escape were instantly rejected by them. On balance, none of them were particularly realistic, and in any case, the thought police had already exposed them and were monitoring them at the time of their conversations about them, making them even more unlikely. What do you think? Were any of Winston and Julia's ideas for escape possible? Which option was the most realistic? Write your thoughts in the comments section. Drop a like if you enjoyed this video, as this really helps the mighty YouTube algorithm know not to confine the channel to the memory hole. And remember, Big Brother is watching you.